We've just walked around the whole of the perimeter of Loch Coolibah, which is the main loch in the release site. And it's interesting, 7 years after the initial release, to still be able to pick up sign of beaver activity. But I think what's reassuring is the difficulty in actually finding some of that sign. It's not immediately obvious. And even where there are significantly large trees that have been felled by the beavers, there is genuine regeneration happening from these stumps. There was one in particular that was about a diameter of about 40 centimetres that is showing regeneration this summer. And clearly there are still active beavers on this site. It looks as if there may be two pairs now established on the loch and the small loch beside it. We've found a newish lodge that I hadn't seen before. And there's certainly some recent activity in that area. So it's reassuring to see that, you know, this amount of time having kind of unfolded since the release, there are still active beavers. Given the average lifespan as well of some of these animals, in that they were not particularly young animals that were first released, they could have been kind of 3 or 4 years old. And an average lifespan of an adult beaver, well, of a beaver, could just be 7 or 8 years anyway. So there's a possibility that we've still got some of the original founder animals that are still resident on the loch, or, and what almost would be better, is that the progeny of some of the released beavers have now set up new territories on the same site. It's evident that they are still selecting foraging tree species close to the water's edge. What we find here, the way that the woodland is made up, is that there's a kind of a margin. There's a broad-leafed native woodland margin near to, so certainly within sort of 30 to 50 metres of the water's edge, and then it transitions into commercial pine plantation, which is useless really for beavers. Given the importance in terms of conservation of this whole area, the Knapdale Forest, in its place in Scotland, I think there is a genuine desire locally, nationally, and certainly within the Forestry Commission of Scotland to try and rehabilitate this site as much as possible to native woodland. There is still obviously a commercial interest in the standing crop that is here, but there have been some large areas that have been clear felled since the start of the trial. And there's certainly no sign of this being replanted, and it would be interesting to see whether or not the long-term strategy and site plan for this area is to either proactively plant up with broadleaf woodland, or just to let successional processes take over, thereby potentially extending, you know, the beaver habitat and native habitat beyond some of the loch margins. And certainly Forestry Commission Scotland were a really key partner in this project. There were two active partners in SWT and RZSS, but without the clear and active support of the Forestry Commission Scotland, allowing this site to be used, and certainly opening gates, literally and metaphorically, to allow the project to unfold on this site, and really facilitating the effective kind of management of the project over the course of the 6 years altogether. And certainly the whole partnership basis of the project was a big lesson for everybody involved. It was a major collaboration, several NGOs and government agencies having to come together and find a kind of a shared way through, an acceptable way through, so that the partnership itself could be seen as a worthy and robust consortium of people, so that when it came to talking to local communities and stakeholders, you know, very local or kind of broader stakeholders, it was possible to present a united front and present a compelling argument as to why people from effectively the other side of Scotland, in Edinburgh, wanted to come to this West Coast site and drop some alien species into this habitat. And there were some clear concerns, you know, from the outset as to what those impacts might be. And I think what is typical of a lot of reintroduction projects, more so with some large predatory species, is if things go wrong, if damage is incurred, who pays for that damage? What sort of compensatory package could be in place? And we did spend time kind of drawing up kind of protocols to say, well, if it is clearly demonstrable that some of your private woodland or riverbank has been detrimentally damaged by beavers, then there would be a scheme within the project to compensate or reinstate and restore, whether it's kind of riverbanks or putting new saplings back in. And I think there were only a couple of instances where, one in particular where a beaver had actually left the main release area. It had crossed over the canal and down into the River Add nearby, and there had clearly been some evidence of some trees that had been recently planted that were then felled by the beavers. So it was an appropriate thing to do for the project partners to compensate for that. But on the whole, there were some early myths that surround beavers that were dispelled. It took a while with some people, in that people believing that beavers do predate on fish. It was, fairly easy process to then convince people that beavers don't eat fish. They are kind of vegetarian in every respect. And there's also a bit of a conflation of the types of activities that are demonstrated by European beavers compared to North American or Canadian beavers. Canadian beavers typically are found on broader river catchments. Because of the topography and structure of those rivers, quite shallow but very broad, the dams that they will then build are significantly larger structures. Therefore, the extent of inundation and flooding as a result of these dams is much more apparent, visibly and practically. They are much bigger concerns. Whereas European beavers tend to live further upstream, and they will tend to dam small burns and creeks and streams that they find, just so that they can create ponds that are no more than a couple of meters deep. And in this sort of landscape where it's quite rugged, it doesn't take a very wide loch that they would produce in order to generate depth of a couple of meters. So the scale of dams, and I think, to be honest, in this whole site there's only one large dam that we've seen, and a couple of smaller dams that exist on some of the smaller tributaries. But on the whole, the structural evidence of beavers is very minimal. It's quite cryptic. You've almost got to know what you're looking for to realise that the beavers are here, and they have been living in this site for 7 years. The other issue in terms of beavers in Scotland was, at the same time that the trial was being planned and unfolding, there was the issue of a known population of beavers on the east side of Scotland, in the catchment of the Tay River along a number of tributaries. Their presence was known about, their origin was unknown. There had been no action in response to those particular beavers. And the landscape there is very different. It's a much flatter, kind of broader terrain. It's much more agricultural, and there was the potential for more conflict with local communities, because it's active farmland. And there's also, it's an area that can flood, and there have been some flood protection schemes that have been put in place that are kind of earth-based. Where these beavers came from, nobody really knows. There's possibly some escapees from private collections, or maybe even beavers that have been deliberately released to the site for people who believe in rewilding, but without going through the formal channels of getting a license and doing the background work. So the history of it is almost irrelevant. The fact was that there were beavers living in the Tay catchment, and possibly up to 100 individuals altogether. Nobody did a full-scale survey, but it could well have been as many as that. Two of the points of conflict were, because they were of unknown origin, they were of unknown provenance. So it's possible and highly likely that these were animals that were not from Norway, unlike the licensed animals in the trial here, which isn't necessarily a problem, other than, well, if there's a viable population of beavers of unknown provenance to that scale, it's likely that they will persist and they will form the basis of a population in Scotland, should the government decree that these animals are going to be kind of legally present back in Scotland itself. Which then asks the fundamental ethical question of, well, what kind of beavers does Scotland want to have back? What are we trying to do? Given that the European beaver, castor fibre, is now doing very well across continental Europe. It is not a species that is in any way endangered or threatened. and it is fairly robust where it's found across 24 countries now on mainland Europe. So the potential release and reintroduction of beavers to Scotland wouldn't be a measure or an intervention that would be for the benefit of the European beaver as a species. And the argument has always been to put it back in order to provide keystone species and facilitative activities back into Knapdale. As an ecosystem engineer, as a facilitator of changing habitats, they open up landscapes to make them more available to other species. So you could say, well, does it matter what types of beaver we have back in Scotland? Does it matter if it is of Norwegian provenance? Does it matter if it is of unknown origin? Hopefully at least of mixed populations from within Europe. And as long as it is European in some way, it's what it does that's more important than exactly what it is. A caveat to that is that there are some Canadian, North American beavers that exist in parts of Finland, which may well have mixed with some other beavers, European beavers. They can interbreed. So there's always the risk that there will be some North American beaver genes in the population in Europe, but it's unlikely that any animals that have got to Scotland do include any of those genes. And again, it asks the same question again of, well, actually, does it matter? In that what we want to see is a species that's capable of manipulating the habitat in such a way that it is of benefit to biodiversity. And on the flip side of that is it also attracts people. It's a source of tourism, wildlife tourism into an area that is very much dependent on people coming from overseas and from other parts of Scotland. So it's a question that will always be there in the background of conservationist minds in terms of the moral and ethical arguments surrounding the provenance of populations that you use to conduct reintroductions.